As Maria just explained, my name is Arnold from Lux Research, and today I would like to talk to you a little bit about bioprinting, what it actually is, where it is headed, and also, of course, what it means for the cosmetics industry, and in particular, what it would mean for your company. But before we get to that, for those of you that aren't actually familiar with Lux Research, we're a strategic advisory firm. We work with companies from the Innovation Top 1000 across the world in many different industries, providing them with strategic advice, finding business opportunity coming out of new emerging technologies, and also helping them to build the business case here. And you'll see the different domains that we cover here on the right. So more from the expertise that we build in advanced materials, in 3D printing, formulation, and a range of other biology topics. I'm going to be talking about bioprinting. But before we actually start talking about bioprinting itself, let's first define what it actually is. Now, most of you here will probably be familiar with 3D printing itself. You're essentially building a three-dimensional structure layer by layer by depositing a metal or a plastic or a ceramic, and in a way building the object. 3D printing is actually already being used in medical practice, and quite substantially, where you're using biocompatible materials, so these are still plastics or metals in general, to build medical devices. So this could be, for example, surgical tools, models that a surgeon can use to prepare for surgery, can also be prosthetics, for example, and also there have been some movement already into making implants. So you make, for example, a custom-made bone implant to use in surgery. Now, the reason why medical 3D printing is distinct from bioprinting is in bioprinting, you're using living biological materials. And this is the key feature here. You're building essentially tissues in the lab, and you're using living cells as well as an extracellular matrix to build these. And with this, you can then start to build, for example, different kinds of tissues like skin, but also, for example, bone or other kinds of tissues. And even if you go a little bit further, you can start to make organs, which is a little bit the holy grail for this. Obviously, that's very complex. You have vasculature, you have nervous systems to deal with, so it's a very complicated process, but also is one that is actually very exciting. There's been a lot of press about it and a lot of excitement about it. Just to give you a little bit of a glimpse of that, these are just some of the clippings around bioprinting that have come out in about the last year. This is just a small fraction of them. And also, over the course of last year, there have been some major announcements for the cosmetics industry using bioprinting, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with at least some of these already. So clearly the cosmetic industry is also getting very excited about the possibilities of bioprinting, but then the big question, of course, is what are these possibilities actually? Well, the first possibility that comes to mind is basically the R&D pipeline in the cosmetics industry, so providing a new method to create a tool to make a new skin model that is more accurate, more reproducible, hopefully also more cost-effective, and use this to essentially speed up the R&D pipeline in the cosmetics industry and also make it more economic by having a more accurate model that allows you to reject a non-functional ingredient earlier on in the process. And of course, if you consider the animal testing ban and essentially the general consumer perception around animal testing, it also provides you with an alternative to animal testing. Now, this is the more immediate application that comes to mind, but there are obviously other applications as well that are very interesting for bioprinting in general. If you start thinking about the future applications, you have clear possibilities to, for example, create new tissues or even new organs. And there's many patients in the world that are in need of these things, so it would solve a fantastic medical need there. But even if you look beyond the clinical realm, there's companies in the world that are, well, it just became a company only about a month ago, but there's companies working on printing meat. It's a Dutch professor working on this. There's another company that is working, for example, on lab-grown leather. So there's other very interesting applications that, in this case, for example, get around the problems with livestock rearing, which is a major environmental hazard. It's very inefficient with the food. There's a lot of CO2 production. So this is one solution there. But then if we go back again to the clinical and the cosmetics industry, there are other very interesting possibilities that are further down the road for the cosmetics industry as well. Because you can imagine if you have a process that allows you to more quickly and more accurately and also more cost effectively produce models, you can start to play with this. So you can imagine that you can start to make models that are more distinct to particular skin types. You have a lot of different skin tones that you could start to recreate reproducibly, different skin types, dry skin, you can maybe have skin that represents the hand palm or the skin under the eye, and you can start to use these kinds of models to make more tinkered, customized products. So even start thinking about personalized cosmetics. And of course, if you consider that the line between the cosmetic surgery and the cosmetics industry is actually getting increasingly blurred, cosmetic surgery, which doesn't have the same complications as clinical surgery around insurance reimbursement, who pays for it, and also clinical validation, cosmetic surgery could actually be one of the early adopters for bioprinting. So clearly there's a lot of very fascinating possibilities for bioprinting, but where does it actually stand today? Well, we've spent a fair bit of time building a model, a market forecast for the 3D printing industry in general, so including, for example, all the manufacturing applications as well. And we find that the market for bioprinting today is actually still very, very small. It is part of the nascent markets, which is the bar on top right here. But we do see that it's growing over time. Now, keep in mind, bioprinting, as I mentioned, it's a very complicated process. It needs a lot of validation, a lot of understanding. So it is definitely still a long path to get to that size that we're showing here. But despite that, there's already some companies that are starting to get into it today. One of those companies that is probably most familiar to everybody here in the room is the partnership that L'Oreal struck up with Organovo. Actually, this collaboration between the two of them already exists for a few years. They started it back in 2013. And the technology of Organovo uses a printing system that prints small clusters, so small groups of cells in a particular structure, and these cells then mature over time and form the final tissue. They actually already have one commercial product on the market. It's a liver tissue system that is used for pharmaceutical testing. And actually, if you think about it, the partnership between L'Oreal and Organovo makes good sense. L'Oreal already is the owner of a company called Episkin, which is actually here on the floor today as well. And that company has been producing from skin samples from donors, have been producing skin models to use for testing. Now, back in 2014, the two of them already reached the first development milestone for this collaboration that they have. And now back at the beginning of this year, they announced the next stage of their development for basically developing these systems for cosmetics testing in specific. Now, as I mentioned, this one is quite familiar, had a lot of press around it as well. But there have been some other announcements as well that I briefly want to discuss as well. One of these is Procter Gamble. So Procter Gamble started up a collaboration with A-Star in Singapore, and it's essentially an open innovation approach where they call academic research groups to submit proposals for applications using bioprinting that is relevant to Procter Gamble's businesses. And they can then win grants for this research. And Procter Gamble actually reserved a budget of 60 million Singapore dollars, which is roughly 44 million US dollars. So they've put quite a substantial sum of money aside for this. Another announcement, just a few months ago, in fact, is from BASF, which is collaborating with a small French firm called Poetis that has been in the bioprinting business for some years already as well. And the aim here is to combine the technology from Poetis with BASF's own skin model, which is called MIME-Skin. And the technology from Poetis is slightly different from Organovo. The basic principle is the same. You deposit cells in a particular structure, which can then mature over time. So the aim for this is to use this model to improve the MIME-Skin model and also over time automate the process of production further and make it more complex, so using multicellular structures, for example. So clearly, if we look at these announcements, the cosmetics industry the bioprinting in the cosmetics industry is starting to pick up some speed here. And actually, if you look at the bioprinting market as a whole, there's a lot of movement there as well. So we talked about Airbus, we talked about Organovo, but these are just some other companies that have announced over the last years that they have a bioprinter or are working on bioprinting or otherwise engaged in that industry. And you'll see there's a lot of different companies here, and what they offer actually ranges from basically a desktop 3D printer that you can buy off Kickstarter that can print cells, all the way through to, for example, something that Organovo has, which is a full service model with co-development. So it's a very wide range in offerings. But one very important thing to consider with these companies is the fact that you're good at printing plastic does not mean that you're going to be good at printing cells. Anybody that has ever worked with cells, and I have spent a lot of time working with cells, they're very funny little creatures. You get one thing wrong, you get the temperature wrong, you get the acidity wrong, you get something wrong that you don't even understand, and they will change, and they will not behave anymore in the way that they're supposed to, which makes your whole model at that point useless. So obviously, the big question now is, with all these different companies here, are they any good? Are they able to basically meet these challenges to get bioprinting developed to where it needs to go? Because there are several pretty big challenges that these companies will have to deal with. First of all, we have the cost, both the cost of the printed materials as well as the cost of the printer system itself. We find actually over time that with these kinds of emerging industries, this tends to resolve itself over time as people get more experienced at it, things scale up and the cost comes down. So in itself, this is not the biggest challenge. What's actually a much bigger challenge is the understanding. Basically understanding what happens when you print cells and how do you print them in such a way that it ends up doing what you want it to do. That biological understanding is something that will definitely take a lot more time, and it's going to be a major challenge also to tackle. And then with that understanding, of course, with a better understanding of what you can achieve, you will also run into the problem that the printers themselves will have to get better to be able to print these much more complicated structures. Skin is not a layer of a few cells, it's very complicated. So that's another major challenge that at that point will have to be met. And one very important challenge as well, and don't forget about this one, is the regulations. These things will have to prove themselves. And we find that the regulatory authorities, they also don't understand this bioprinting thing. So for them, they're going to be very cautious about something that they don't understand. So it's very important also for the bioprinting industry to engage with the regulators and help them learn, educate them on what is actually important to control in this particular industry. So that's another pretty big challenge that is sometimes very difficult to meet. So if we have these different challenges, quite daunting challenges here, how then do we get a bit of an idea how these companies are going to meet this? Well, to give you a little bit more insight into that, let's first take a close look at these companies. So we as a company speak to the management of these different startups quite regularly. We know a lot of these companies very well, including also Organovo. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at them. So they were founded in 2007. They IPO'd actually just a few years ago. They have an employee count right now of about 70 people. And as I mentioned, their technology is basically printing clusters of cells, small droplets essentially of cells that they put in a particular structure, which then matures over time. They use this technology to make tissue assays, which are used mostly for pharmaceutical testing, mimicking the actual tissue. And their strategy mostly revolves around co-development partnerships to bring these assays to the market. And they have some pretty major partnerships already with, for example, with Roche, with Pfizer, with United Therapeutics, now also, of course, with L'Oreal. Their business model revolves around milestone payments. So whenever they meet a particular milestone, they get a certain payment for that, plus royalties on products that have been developed using their assays. Now, if you consider that the only commercial product they have on the market today is this liver assay, these royalties aren't really rolling in yet, which explains that their revenue isn't that high yet today. But overall, together with their development partnership with L'Oreal, they're doing fairly well, which is also why our take on this company is that they're definitely one of the pioneers, and they're showing good progress in the bioprinting space. We do always caution our clients, though, that the transparency of this company in terms of how their development is progressing together with these partners isn't all too transparent, and therefore we do caution our clients to evaluate this carefully before engaging with them. So Organovo, as mentioned, has its co-development type of business model. Another, and there are several of these as well, type of business model is basically providing equipment. One example for this is EnvisionTech. Now, maybe those of you that can actually read it, but let me spell it out as well. EnvisionTech revenue is a lot higher than that of Organovo. Organovo was just about $500,000, this is 25 million. While their employee count is only double. Now, the reason for that is that EnvisionTech has an existing business in normal 3D printing. They've been doing this for several years already, they're quite good at it, and they just print essentially plastics and metals for manufacturing. Now, from this expertise in normal 3D printing, they've developed a bioplotter, which is their bioprinting platform, which can print a whole range of different materials, including living cells, biomaterials, but also, for example, plastics and metals and ceramics. Their strategy is actually to market, on the one hand, their existing systems for normal 3D printing, and then the bioplotter system is very much focused towards academic research groups and other research organizations that want to print bioscaffolds for tissue engineering applications, for drug delivery applications, and that basically have a lot of own expertise in making this work. So it's really just an equipment provider. And this is also the reason why we caution for this particular company that the core of their business is actually outside of the bioprinting space. And therefore, you have to very carefully evaluate if you have the required expertise to do the material development for bioprinting, because EnvisionTech is perfectly happy selling the system alone. Now, these are two different companies, two very different business models. How can we actually then tell from this how bioprinting might evolve over time? Well, to get a little bit of an idea for that, let's take a look at 3D printing itself. It's a much more mature business, and the history of 3D printing can maybe teach us something about how bioprinting will develop over time. Because 3D printing actually started out as technology for prototyping. It was used in the R&D lab for large organizations where they can quickly make a prototype, play around with it, make something new, and very quickly make new iterations of the product. But over time, this is actually developed into essentially a method of manufacturing final parts that go into final products. And as an example, the Boeing Dreamliner that I will be getting onto tonight actually has 30 printed parts on board. We see a little bit the same thing for bioprinting. Bioprinting today is a tool in the lab which is used to more easily make different kinds of tissues. But again, over time that may evolve to a point where that can actually be used to print entire organs. Now, do keep in mind, I've mentioned it before, bioprinting is much more complicated than printing actual materials. So because of that, and also because of the regulations that apply, which are much more stringent, it will probably take a lot longer to actually get to that point. And also because of the sheer complexity of the whole process, and we've seen this again with 3D printing, we would actually expect that there's going to be a handful of companies that successfully make it to the market before anybody else does. But still, keeping that in mind, how will that path then progress, and what will be basically the driving force behind it? Well, for that, let's take a case study. We talked about the airlines already, so let's take a look at Airbus. What's their driving force for using 3D printing? Well, Airbus, if they're developing new products, they use very expensive materials. They use high-end carbon fibers, they use titanium, it's all really expensive. And then in manufacturing, you actually have a lot of waste. You have the machining of the products, there's a lot of rejection from parts that don't work. So in the end, you actually lose a lot of these expensive materials. On top of that, they have a pressure to make lighter aircraft, less weight to reduce the fuel cost. So combined with that pressure, they found an answer in 3D printing. And this is an example. The part on the back is the old-fashioned part, which is made with traditional methods. The part in front is the printed version of it. And just by looking at it, you can already see that the one in front is going to be a lot lighter. Now, we see a similar type of driving force with, for example, L'Oreal. They have a very expensive R&D pipeline. There's a lot of candidates that get fairly far down the pipeline and then get rejected because they don't work in animal testing, for example, which drives up the cost tremendously. Plus, they get additional pressure from the ban on animal testing, and they need alternatives. And that alternative, in that case, L'Oreal found in printing skin. Now, again, as we mentioned, it's going to be a while before many companies get to the market because it's very complex. It takes a lot of development expertise to get here. But this is also something that we would expect to evolve over time and get basically more accessible and also more advanced. We've seen it with 3D printing, where it started out with very simple systems that just essentially have something printing one layer, printing the next layer, printing the next layer, and building an object. But over time, as this industry matured, people started using more advanced systems. They started using robotics. This is actually a picture of a printer system which is using robotic arms to essentially print free in space. They can print much more complicated shapes, and you end up with much more complex systems. Similar thing will happen over time with bioprinting. Today, it is very similar to where 3D printing was several years ago. It's essentially printing a gel with cells in it in a layer-by-layer fashion. And that too, over time, will evolve to get something as complex as the skin, which obviously it has the hair follicles, it has sweat glands, it has vasculature, it has all the different cell types in there. It will get much more complicated, and the printers will have to evolve tremendously to get to that complexity. And that innovation and that development doesn't necessarily need to come from where you would expect. Because what happened in 3D printing, 3D Systems is a 3D printer that was a long and established player. It started out on the prototyping business, and they used what is called a closed materials model, which means that you have to buy the material from them to work on the printer. Very much the same as that you have to go to the shop to buy a print cartridge for your printer at home. Same sort of structure you see for Organovo. They have a very established expertise in the cell culture part of this. They're one of the largest player, even though they're still small, but they're one of the largest player in this field today. And again, they have a lot of involvement in the printer platform itself. Now, what we saw in 3D printing, that over time, as this industry matured, other players came to the market and started using different business models. So Arkham is one of these. It's a more recent entrant into the space, and it has actually a business that is not based on prototyping, but is based on functional parts. And they're using what is called an open materials model. So anybody that has sufficient expertise in material formulation can make something that will work on their printer system. That may happen with bioprinting as well, that somebody will come and make something that works better for the larger industry. Just at this point, we won't be able to tell yet who that is because this industry is too new to be able to tell that. But keeping this in mind, and also keeping in mind with all the challenges that I have in mind, how then can you actually, as a company, evaluate bioprinting and also evaluate if that actually makes sense for your company? And how do you then look at all these different companies that I showed you and pick which ones are a good match for you, or are the good ones already taken? Well, to help you with that, I would like to propose a simple framework analysis to help you evaluate these opportunities. So to evaluate different opportunities in bioprinting, this is different companies in bioprinting, you can evaluate each company on two different axes. First of all, we look at the company itself. Can the company actually meet these challenges? So for this, we have to evaluate a number of different things. First of all, the company itself, are they showing good momentum? Are they getting new partnerships? Are they getting investments? Are they making new product announcements? Basically, does it look likely that they will still be here next year? Because it will likely be a startup. Startups go bust all the time, so that's very important to evaluate. The next part that's also very important, does it look like their technology is suited to get to that more high throughput, lower cost production that you will need in the cosmetics industry? Also, can it print multiple materials? Can it basically print more complex systems? And also, can it meet the regulations that will exist for this kinds of equipment, whether it's in a lab or for safety testing? Can it meet these regulations? The other very important aspect to consider on the other axis, does it actually make sense for your company? And obviously that will depend very much on what your company does. But some of the things you can consider here is, will you actually need someone that provides you the service to help develop the materials and the printing? Or are you happy with just having a printer? What are you going to be using it for? Are you going to be using it for safety testing? Does it have to basically be quality controlled to meet all these safety tests? Or are you just going to use it as a tool in the lab? And if you're going to be using it in the lab, is it just going to be for basic testing of skin? Or do you actually want to make something far more complicated, and do you need a much more advanced printing system? And one last thing that is very important to consider, is it actually any better than what you're doing today? And that's also a very important part. So whenever you're evaluating using this framework, do take your current alternatives along as well and evaluate those too, and make sure that it actually makes sense. Now obviously, this is all theory, right? So let's take an example and look at how this works in practice. Now, if you're going to be plotting this onto the chart, the different companies are going to end up in different quadrants. So you average these scores, put them on the score, and then something might up in the bottom left quadrant. Now, if it ends up there, it means that the company isn't doing particularly good, and it's also not a very good fit with your particular needs. So ignore the company, move on. Top right, we're going to find those companies that are a really good fit with what you need and they're doing really well. Go and talk to them, absolutely engage them. The other two quadrants, we find the more interesting ones. So in the bottom right, we will find those companies that are a really good fit with your needs, but the company isn't really quite there yet. So for those, don't engage with them now because they might not be there next year, but keep an eye on them because if they do actually get any better, you could be the first one to strike up a partnership with them. And then in the top left, we find the companies that are doing really well, but aren't really a good fit to your company. So here actually you can explore this further. Maybe if you're big enough and have the buying power, you can convince them to change their strategy to meet your needs. Or maybe there's a third partner that you can add to the mix that can help you bridge that gap. So obviously this helps you evaluate these companies and basically visually plot them out. So to take now an example, obviously your precise needs will depend very much on where you actually sit in the cosmetics value chain. But for the sake of an example, let's call it Implements Cosmetics. And it's a company, our mission of our example company today is that we provide innovative cosmetics with highly active ingredients. Now, we're a medium-sized company. We're about 100 employees, roughly, about 50 million in revenue. And we have a very international focus on formulation. So we don't actually make any raw ingredients itself. We just formulate. We have business both in Asia as well as in Europe, selling into 35 countries, R&D in both continents. And one very important thing to consider here, we don't actually have a very large R&D staff and a very large R&D budget. So we won't really be able to take a lot of that development in-house. So we'll want somebody that is able to help us out with that. All right, so keeping that in mind, let's take a look first at Organovo. Now, as I mentioned for Organovo, they have several commercial products on the market. They have a couple of very strong partnerships already, so they're doing pretty good on the company's strength on the y-axis. And also they have a very strong focus on co-development of products, which is good because we would need that. So they're also doing pretty good on the x-axis, which puts them in our top right quadrant. Now, Organovo and L'Oréal's deal is actually exclusive deal for the use of skin for non-prescription applications, so anything outside of the doctor's office. Which means that in this particular example, they wouldn't be any good because they have an exclusive partnership. So it's just for the sake of example in this case. Let's take another example in that case. We have another company called Bio3D Technologies. They have a printer system which is actually very similar to this Envision Tech that I showed earlier. Not highly differentiated printer system for that matter, but they do claim that they can actually print at a lower cost than Envision Tech and another company called Siseng. Now, their strategy is to basically work with the R&D customers, so very much customers in corporate R&D labs, in research labs, in hospital labs, to develop these systems. but actually the process to make the printable material, so that the cell solution that you print, that is something that you'll have to do yourself. They don't actually do that, which makes it a bit more complicated for us. So with that in mind, keep in mind that the technology isn't really differentiated, but they claim, at least, they're from 2013, right? So that still has to be proven if it actually pans out, but they claim it's lower cost. So that's promising, at least on the y-axis, that may help them grow as a company. But because we have to do the development of the materials ourselves, they're not a really good fit with what we need for our example. So that puts them in the top left. And maybe we can find another partner that can help us develop the materials to make this work. And then one last example.
Natural products antimicrobial complex seminar will begin in 10 minutes in the Innovation Seminar Theater.
So one last example. CSEng, I just mentioned them. So they actually have, again, a printer system which is fairly similar to what EnvisionTech has. In fact, the founder of CSEng is one of the founders of EnvisionTech. They can...
Specialty Natural Products Antimicrobial Complex Seminar will begin in 10 minutes in the Innovation Seminar Theater.
So they can actually print many different materials, which is helpful because we like to produce innovative products as a company. The printing process itself, though, is somewhat slower compared to the competitors, which could be a problem for the company itself because people will want to have some speed. Also, they work on hardware development, but again, the actual sales is primarily to research labs. So it's a somewhat better fit, but not fantastic. And on that basis, basically, considering they have wide material capabilities, which is good for our needs, but the printing process is slow, and also if you look at their actual sales, it hasn't grown so much over the years that they've been in the market, which is for some time now. The company strength isn't actually that high, so that puts them over there in the bottom right. So I hope by showing you some of these examples, I've shown you that by critically evaluating each opportunity on these different metrics, you can evaluate if the bioprinting makes sense for your company, and if it does make sense, what kind of opportunities are interesting for striking up a partnership in this space. So, in conclusion, I hope I've shown you that bioprinting has clearly been picking up some momentum over the last year, with a couple of major announcements being made from major companies. We talked a little bit about the different drivers that exist and the different possibilities that exist for bioprinting. Obviously, there's the animal testing ban, which is a very interesting opportunity here. But there's other more interesting possibilities further down for example, producing customized or even personalized products. Now, to get there, we've discussed a number of the different challenges that exist that companies will have to overcome to essentially get to that low-cost, high-speed, high-throughput, high reproducibility ability to print. And to actually evaluate these kinds of opportunities, I've shown you a simple framework analysis to visually evaluate if bioprinting makes sense compared to your alternatives, and if it makes sense, which of these companies that are emerging in the market today are actually interesting for you to engage. So with that, thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.